Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer had called her in front of the entire ER staff during shift change, his voice carrying the kind of dismissal that made grown men look at their shoes. Katie Morrison didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She adjusted the 4 line on the patient in Trauma Bay 3 and kept her hand steady, the titanium ring on her right hand catching the fluorescent light as she worked. The other nurses shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Nobody defended her. That was 6 weeks ago, and the silence had only deepened since. St. Michael's Medical Center in Colorado Springs occupies a sprawling concrete footprint on the eastern edge of the city, all emergency exits and loading docks painted institutional gray. The night shift starts at 7 p.m. and ends when the sun breaks over the Front Range Mountains, and Katie had been working those hours for exactly 6 months, long enough to know where every supply cabinet locked, short enough that nobody really knew her. She preferred it that way. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby overhead, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with something sharper, something like fear and open wounds, had become as familiar to her as breathing. She moved through the corridors with a kind of efficient precision that comes from practice in much darker places, her scrubs fitting loosely enough to hide the shoulder hitch that never quite healed properly, her dark hair pulled back so tight it left marks on her temples. The break room on the 3rd floor was where she learned about the discrepancies. Coffee pot on the left side of the counter, vending machine humming its plastic song in the corner, and a clipboard someone had left on the table filled with equipment requisition forms. Katie had been microwaving her dinner, a container of rice and grilled chicken from home, nothing fancy, nothing that required conversation, when she noticed the numbers. Chest tube kits, ordered 47, inventory showed 23. Defibrillator pads, ordered 312, found 189. Rapid infusers, ordered 8, recorded 4. She wasn't supposed to notice. She wasn't supposed to care. But hands that had held lives together in the dark don't simply learn to ignore patterns, and her brain had been trained to catalog inconsistencies with the same precision it used to assess trauma. Dr. Mercer noticed her noticing. He was watching from the nurse's station 2 days later when she pulled the supply inventory logs from the computer, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to look. His pen stopped tapping against his clipboard. His eyes narrowed. He was in his mid-50s, grey-streaked at the temples, the kind of man whose suit probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent, and he wore his position like armor, the silver-edged name badge, the way he stood slightly elevated on the observation platform, the manner in which other doctors deferred to him in hallways. Dr. Harrison Mercer. ER Director. 23 years at St. Michael's. The kind of institutional presence that made him untouchable. She felt his attention like pressure change before a storm. By the next shift, the social attacks began in earnest. Small, calibrated, deniable. During morning rounds, he commented on her lack of initiative when she asked a clarifying question about a patient's medication history, just loud enough for the residents to hear, not quite loud enough to constitute an overt reprimand. During a trauma stabilization, he made a remark about her overly technical approach to a simple 4 placement, his voice dripping with condescension that made her jaw clench but her hands never wavered. When she raised her hand during a staff meeting about equipment orders, he cut her off mid-sentence. "I think we can trust the procurement department to handle inventory, Morrison. Perhaps you should focus on actual patient care." The room had gone perfectly still. Someone's coffee cup made a soft clink against a saucer. Nobody made eye contact with her. Katie learned quickly what silence meant in a hospital. It meant you were alone. She worked through it the way she'd been trained to work through everything, by not reacting. By making herself smaller. By accepting the role of outsider she was being written into with the kind of discipline that comes from understanding that showing anger only gives people ammunition. She ate her lunch alone in her car. She arrived early and left late, minimizing break room exposure. She spoke only when spoken to, and kept her answers brief and clinical. "Yes, doctor." "No, doctor. I'll check on that." Her voice became something softer than it had been in 6 months prior, a deliberate modulation downward that made her sound younger, less threatening, more easily dismissed. It was a mask she'd worn before, in a different life, before she became someone the Pentagon had to bury. But the ring on her hand remained untouched. She never tried to hide it. Never thought to. The titanium band caught light with every movement, every fall line she adjusted, every vital sign she checked, every patient she helped transfer from stretcher to hospital bed. The Ranger scroll was engraved in precise detail across the crown, the symbol so small most people never noticed it unless they were looking for it. Katie touched it unconsciously during moments of stress, a habit she'd never broken, a talisman from a life she'd agreed to leave behind. She had given one exactly like it to Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen 3 years ago at Fort Benning, during the last briefing before deployment to Ramadi. The same ring, the same engraving, the same meaning, we are warriors, and this is the proof. Chen had gone with her into that city. Into the dust and the heat and the sound of mortars that came without warning. She hadn't heard from him since the operation went sideways. Dr. Mercer's attention intensified with each passing shift. He began assigning her the most difficult patients during the most chaotic hours, watching from the nurse's station to see if she would crack under pressure. She didn't. He started standing closer during her assessments, his presence meant to intimidate, his skeptical silence suggesting she was doing everything incorrectly. She continued working. He made comments about her unusual response times to trauma alerts, implying she was either incompetent or trying too hard, a no-win calibration designed to make her doubt herself. Katie didn't doubt herself. She had been trained by people whose careers depended on seeing through weakness, and whatever weakness she had left in Ramadi. What Dr. Mercer couldn't see was what his campaign had actually accomplished. He had made her invisible to her colleagues. The other nurses had learned to accept his dismissal of her by simply not engaging with her at all. The residents avoided asking her questions. The support staff scheduled their breaks to avoid the break room when she was there. She had become the kind of person people looked through rather than at, the background figure in Scrubs, competent but unremarkable, the night shift nurse who worked alone because working alone was safer than being part of something that could be used against her. It was 2:02 a.m. when the radio call came through. The dispatcher's voice cut through the hospital's ambient hum with the kind of urgency that made every head in the ER snap upright. County dispatch to St. Michael's. ETA 8 minutes, Highway 24, vehicle rollover, single patient, male, early 30s, unconscious, severe trauma, military identification on scene. Katie was updating a discharge summary when she heard it, her hands going still on the keyboard. The ER director's voice came next, clipped and commanding, trauma bay ready. Get orthopedics on standby. The controlled chaos of preparation began, nurses moving equipment, residents checking trauma supplies, the attending physicians materializing in that way they did when serious cases were incoming. Katie stood without waiting to be asked. She began laying out the trauma setup with the muscle memory that never really leaves you, 14-gauge angiocath needles organized by size, sterile field prepped, suction canister fitted, ventilation bags arranged within arm's reach. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in worse conditions, in darker places, under fire. Nobody asked her to do this. She simply did it, the way some people breathe. The ambulance sirens grew louder. When the paramedics wheeled the patient in, Katie saw him and felt something shift in her chest so profound it took everything she had to keep her face neutral. The patient was male, mid-30s, face wrapped partially in dressing from lacerations, left arm clearly broken above the elbow, ribs visibly fractured from the way his breathing was shallow and labored. But it was his right hand, the one lying palm up on the stretcher beside his body, that made her stop breathing. The titanium ring caught the overhead light with a dull gleam. The Ranger scroll was unmistakable. The engraving was identical. Not similar. Not coincidentally the same. Identical. The room went dead silent for a fraction of a second, the space between one breath and the next. Katie's eyes flicked up to the patient's face, to the features she couldn't quite make out through the bandaging, and then back down to the ring as Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the moment. All right, let's get vitals, full trauma assessment, we need x-rays on the left arm and chest, someone check for internal bleeding. The machinery of emergency medicine reasserted itself, the organized chaos of people trained to work under pressure, and Katie moved with them, her voice steady as she called out vital readings, BP 118/74 and dropping, heart rate 96, O2 sat at 94 on supplemental, respiratory rate 24, GCS score of 8, we've got some rib fractures here. Her hands were exactly where they needed to be, her movements precise and clinical and showing absolutely nothing of the fact that the unconscious man on the stretcher was wearing the ring she had given him 3 years ago in a different life, in a city that was supposed to have buried everyone involved in what happened there. The paramedics continued their handoff, and Katie listened without reaction as they described the scene: ejected from vehicle, found approximately 47 meters from the wreckage, no wallet found, no identification, only the ring and the clothing indicating he was military. The fire department had noted the specific wear pattern on his hands, the calluses and scarring consistent with weapons handling and tactical movement. Likely a serving member. Possibly special operations based on the gear recovered at the scene. Dr. Mercer ordered him moved to the ICU pending surgery, and the team began the transport. Katie didn't move to follow. She stood at the trauma bay entrance, ostensibly checking the supply inventory, while her eyes tracked the unconscious man being wheeled toward the elevator. The titanium ring caught the fluorescent light one more time before he disappeared from view. In that moment, in that silence between 1 second and the next, 3 years of careful civilian identity began to crack like old concrete. The John Doe's chest rose and fell beneath the oxygen mask like a man drowning in air that wasn't helping. Katie Morrison ran the penlight across his pupils, equal, reactive, no obvious head bleed, and then she saw it again. The titanium ring on his left ring finger. The Ranger scroll engraved into the band, identical to hers, identical to the one she'd given to Staff Sergeant Chen 3 years ago in a Fort Benning barracks before he took her slot on the team and she disappeared into a new name and a new life that was supposed to be permanent. She couldn't stop looking at it. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm around him, heart rate 88, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation 94%, but Katie's hands trembled as she checked his chart again. No identification. No wallet. No dog tags. Just a notation, unidentified male, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, blast trauma consistent with IED strike, multiple compound fractures, possible shrapnel lodgement in thoracic cavity. The intake nurse had written Army Ranger tattoo on left bicep, partially visible beneath field dressing. Army Ranger. The same unit. The same ring. The same blast pattern she'd seen before. Katie pulled up the chest X-ray on the bedside monitor and her breath stopped completely. The shrapnel constellation, scattered fragments in a distinctive arc across the anterior chest cavity, matched the pattern she'd memorized in Ramadi 3 years ago when 4 Rangers died in the same compound before the Pentagon buried the operation and buried everyone involved in it. Before Captain Katie Morrison ceased to exist and became a night shift nurse in Colorado Springs because the alternative was federal prison for violating classification laws that technically made her a ghost. You're spending an awful lot of time with our mystery soldier. Dr. Mercer's voice came from behind her. Not loud. Controlled. The kind of voice that made most people freeze. Katie turned away from the X-ray, her face flat, her hands already moving to her pockets in the gesture of professional deference that had become second nature. Just running baseline vitals, she said. I'm sure you are. Mercer stepped closer to the light box, his shadow falling across the X-ray images. His tailored white coat had cost more than Katie's monthly rent, she'd seen the designer label when he wasn't looking. Makes me wonder what you're really looking for, though. These Rangers all look the same to you. Katie didn't answer. The trick was not to answer. The trick was to be small enough to disappear. Come with me, Mercer said. It wasn't a request. He walked her to the break room where a family was waiting for news on their grandfather, a veteran with a bleeding ulcer and papers from the VA that Mercer had already scanned with dismissal in his eyes. The grandfather's daughter stood near the coffee machine, her face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 12 hours in an ER waiting room. Mrs. Chen, Mercer said, his voice shifting to something warm and concerned, your father is stable. We're running one more scan before we move him to recovery. The woman nodded, tears threatening. Mercer put a hand on her shoulder with the practiced confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to touch people. Then he turned to Katie. "Morrison, this is exactly the kind of inappropriate emotional attachment I've been documenting," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the break room. The volume was deliberate. The timing was precise. "You're too invested in patience. It compromises objectivity. This is why floaters like you don't last in professional environments. The mystery soldier isn't your responsibility. He's a case study. Nothing more." Mrs. Chen watched, uncomfortable, while a nurse from the evening shift pretended to examine the vending machine. Katie met Mercer's eyes with a flat, cold stare that didn't blink. Her heart was running at 118 beats per minute. She could feel it in her neck, in her wrists, but her face remained empty. No tremor. No visible reaction. Just a woman absorbing criticism in a hospital break room like 1,000 other criticisms she'd absorbed. "You understand?" Mercer asked. "Yes, sir," Katie said quietly. "Good." He turned back to Mrs. Chen. "Your father is in excellent hands. The most important thing now is getting him rested." He left. The nurse by the vending machine suddenly had an urgent page. Mrs. Chen looked at Katie with an apologetic expression that cut deeper than Mercer's words ever could. Katie poured her coffee into the sink untouched. The next morning, she arrived for her shift and saw it immediately, a formal write-up posted on the unit board in the break room, her name in bold at the top. 12 protocol violations, each one dated and detailed with the precision of someone who'd had a lot of practice fabricating things. Failure to maintain appropriate professional distance from patient Chen during initial assessment. Repeated questioning of inventory procedures outside her scope of practice. Persistent resistance to direct orders from attending physician. Pattern of insubordination spanning 6 months. Katie read it while other staff filed in for shift change, their conversations dying when they saw her standing at the board. Linda, the veteran charge nurse who'd been kind, grabbed her coffee and left mid-sentence. Then markers from respiratory. Then the entire break room, one by one, until Katie stood alone at the table, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic. She didn't sit down. She just left. That night, during shift change in front of 30 staff members, Mercer pulled her aside in the main hallway where everyone could hear. His voice was calm. Controlled. The kind of competent cruelty that only worked when it was methodical. "Your file is becoming quite extensive, Morrison," he said, tapping a folder against his leg. 14 separate incident reports now. Failure to follow protocol. Questioning administrative decisions. And now we have the concerning focus on the John Doe, the one you apparently recognize from somewhere, though your background check shows you've never deployed. Katie didn't speak. The rule was never to speak first. "I think you're experiencing what we call savior complex," Mercer continued. "You see a soldier, and something triggers. Maybe you had a father in the military. Maybe you watch too much television. But this patient isn't your project, Morrison. He's a case. And your inability to maintain professional boundaries is becoming a liability." He smiled. "We call people like you Rambo nurse, too much ego, not enough training." Several staff members laughed nervously. The laughter hung in the hallway like poison gas. Katie's hands were relaxed at her sides. Her face showed nothing. Her breathing remained steady. The trembling that had started 3 years ago in Ramadi, the trembling that came from holding your friend's intestines back into his body while calling for a medevac that was 3 hours out, that trembling was locked somewhere deep enough that only she could feel it. The silence after Mercer finished stretched for exactly 3 seconds. The hallway held its breath. Then Katie said, "You put on a good show for someone who signs off on equipment we never receive, Doctor. I'm sure the supply company appreciates the volume." Mercer's jaw tightened. His hand actually clenched into a fist before he caught himself. Katie turned and walked toward the patient rooms while whispers erupted behind her like fire through grass. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She'd spent 3 years being invisible. One more night of it wouldn't break her. But at 2:51 a.m., during the deepest part of the shift when the hospital emptied out except for the critical cases, Katie found herself standing in the John Doe's room again. She wasn't assigned to him anymore, Mercer had made that clear. But she checked on him anyway, the way a ghost checks on the living. His breathing had changed. Subtle. The kind of deterioration that most nurses would miss on first pass, but Katie had spent 12 years reading dying bodies in the dark. His respiratory rate was up to 22 breaths per minute. His oxygen saturation was dropping incrementally, 94 to 93 to 92. His head was tilted slightly to the right, and when she looked at his chest, she saw the tracheal deviation, the subtle bulging beneath his ribs that meant his right lung was collapsing under pressure. Tension pneumothorax. He had minutes before his heart would collapse completely. Katie's hands moved on their own, muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. She pulled the monitor lead from his chest to see the full anatomy, and there it was, the telltale signs written in the mechanics of his failing body, the decreased breath sounds on the right, the hyperresonance to percussion, the rising venous pressure visible in his neck despite the low blood volume. The monitor showed his oxygen saturation dropping in real time. 94%. 89%. 82%. The numbers fell like a clock counting down to zero. The monitor's beep became a shriek. Soft at first, then climbing in pitch like a siren winding up from deep underground. Katie's head snapped toward the bed where Chen lay motionless, his chest barely rising. The oxygen saturation number on the screen flickered red, 94. Then 87. Then 78, and still dropping like an elevator with a severed cable. She was moving before conscious thought could catch up. Muscle memory. 3 years of muscle memory that lived in her tendons and bone marrow. The blue tint spreading across Chen's lips told her everything. One side of his chest rose with each breath. The other stayed flat. Collapsed lung. Pressure building inside the chest cavity, crushing his heart toward the opposite side like a fist closing around an organ. Tension pneumothorax. The kind that killed soldiers in 15 seconds if you didn't decompress it in the next 10. The code button was already under her palm. Red light flashing above the door. The alarm echoing down the corridor would bring the code team from the 3rd floor, 3 floors away, which meant 90 seconds minimum, which meant Chen would be in cardiac arrest before they rounded the corner. She had maybe 2 minutes. Maybe less. The crash cart was 3 steps away. Katie grabbed the chest tube kit, 14-gauge angiocath, the curved Kelly clamp, the plastic catheter threaded on the needle like a viper waiting to strike. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Fear was data. Fear was information. Fear told you exactly what needed to happen next. The monitor screamed. 65% oxygen saturation. His lips were the color of a bruise. "What are you doing?" A nurse from the adjacent room appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "Getting a setup." Katie's voice was flat. Clinical. Just another task on a night shift that hadn't yet learned it was about to change everything. The combat knife was still there. Still strapped to her ankle inside the compression sock she wore under her scrubs. She'd carried it since Ramadi. Told herself 100 times she'd get rid of it. Told herself she'd never need it again. Told herself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Her hand went down. The knife slipped free like it had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact patient, this exact second when the universe tilted and demanded a choice. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a ghost materializing from the fluorescent hum of the corridor. "Step away from the patient, Morrison. You're not assigned to this room." Katie didn't look at him. The knife was in her left hand. The chest tube kit was in her right. Chen's oxygen saturation hit 62% and his heart rate climbed to 146 as his body screamed for air that wasn't coming. Tension pneumothorax. She was already positioning him, already feeling for the landmarks, the space between the ribs where the knife would go. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether it was a trauma tent in Ramadi or a sterile hospital room in Colorado Springs. The body didn't care about location. The body just needed air. You are not authorized to perform that procedure. Mercer's voice had taken on a different texture now. The smooth arrogance was gone. What remained was sharp and dangerous. Step away. Now. Katie looked at the dying man in the bed. Looked at the titanium ring catching the fluorescent light on his left hand. Looked at the ring that said Staff Sergeant Chen was someone's soldier, someone's friend, someone's reason to keep breathing when the world tried to stop you. Looked at the choice. Save the ghost or save the man. She made the incision. The blade moved with the terrifying fluid precision of something that had been trained for years in the worst places on Earth. No hesitation. No tremor. Just the separation of skin and intercostal muscle and the hiss of air escaping from the tension cavity like a tire deflating in fast forward. The chest tube slid in. Immediate. Perfect. The oxygen saturation climbed, 65. 71, 78. 84, the rhythm of the monitor softened from shriek to manageable alarm. His lips shifted from bruised blue back toward something resembling human. She stabilized the tube. Secured it with her hands moving through the steps the way a musician's fingers found chords without thought. The combat knife went onto the sterile tray beside the equipment. Her scrubs were blood-soaked across the front. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. The code team burst through the door. 4 of them, led by a resident named Patterson who looked like he was about to say something and then saw Mercer's face and understood that something catastrophic had already happened. He's decompressed, Katie said. She wasn't assigned to this room. She wasn't authorized to speak. She spoke anyway. Tension pneumo. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. O2 sat was in the 60s. Now 84 and climbing. Heart rate 146, still tachycardic but perfusing. Patterson looked from Katie to Chen to the combat knife on the sterile tray. His mouth opened. Closed. Mercer was filming on his phone. Not speaking. Just filming. His face had gone a shade of purple that suggested all the blood in his body had gathered in his skull and was looking for an exit. I need you to step back, Morrison, Patterson said carefully. The tone of someone trying to negotiate with something dangerous. Katie stepped back. Mercer's voice cut through the sound of the monitor and the ventilator and the surrounding chaos with the precision of a blade. You just ended your career. She met his eyes. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was years of combat training running through her nervous system and asking permission to do things that would have made the Geneva Convention necessary. I kept him alive, she said. You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure in front of a code team. You used equipment that wasn't logged out to your name. You used a weapon inside this hospital. I have video of all of it. Mercer's phone was still recording. Within the hour, you're going to be escorted out of this building by security. Within 2 hours, you're going to receive a termination notice citing violations of Hospital Policy 7.3.2 and the unauthorized practice of advanced life support procedures. I'm calling the medical board, the state nursing commission, and the local police department. Patterson cleared his throat. Doctor, the patient's vitals are stable. Whatever protocol was. I don't care if Moses himself came down and decompressed this patient, Mercer said. The words came out like he was crushing them between his teeth. She performed that procedure without authorization. That's termination. That's a felony, depending on how the prosecutor feels about it. He turned and walked back out into the hallway, already dialing his phone as he disappeared. The code team moved in around Chen, checking the tube placement, ordering chest films, running through the protocols for a patient who'd just been resurrected by someone who wasn't supposed to save him. Katie pulled off her gloves. The sound was like thunder in the small room. What you did was, Patterson started. Unauthorized, Katie said. I know. It was also the reason he's not dead. She didn't answer. She was already moving toward the door, already understanding the machinery that had just been set in motion. Every second she stayed in this room was evidence. Every moment she didn't walk away was a nail in a coffin she'd built with her own hands by choosing a stranger's life over her own invisibility. The corridor was empty. Mercer's voice carried from somewhere down the hallway, already on the phone with someone. Already beginning the systematic demolition. Already setting fires that would burn everything Katie had constructed. She pulled off her scrubs in the locker room. Changed into street clothes that felt like they belonged to someone else. The combat knife stayed on the counter. She couldn't take it with her. Not with security cameras. Not with Mercer's video and a felony charge waiting like a trap. The parking lot was empty except for the rain, which had turned to something harder and more aggressive during the hours she'd been inside. Katie stood under the overhang for a moment, watching the water hammer the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody was supposed to give. She'd saved him. That was the truth that mattered. Everything else was just the price. Dr. Mercer arrived at the trauma bay at 11:56 p.m., precisely 7 minutes after Katie's hands had stopped moving, precisely 3 seconds after the monitor settled into a steady rhythm that said survival instead of death. His eyes found the chest tube first, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. His gaze climbed from the foreline to Katie's face, reading the truth in her absolute stillness, her composure like a soldier standing at attention before the firing squad. She didn't flinch. Didn't apologize. Didn't even look away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he processed what he was seeing, an unauthorized invasive procedure, performed with what looked like field precision, on his patient, in direct violation of Hospital Policy 7.3.2 and the explicit orders he'd given not 30 minutes earlier when he decided to wait for the code team, to follow proper channels, to document everything. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Controlled. Terrifying in its absolute certainty. Everyone in this room is a witness to what just happened. He pulled out his tablet with the smooth motion of someone who'd performed this exact choreography before. His fingers flew across the screen, typing with mechanical precision. Dr. Chen did not authorize this procedure. Hospital policy explicitly forbids unauthorized invasive intervention. All staff present will provide written statements within the hour. The tablet's light reflected in his eyes as he tapped and swiped, his movements economical and deadly as a surgeon's scalpel. Katie watched him work and understood in that moment that he'd been waiting for her to give him exactly this kind of ammunition, legitimate, documented, witnessed, irrefutable. She'd handed him the kill shot on a silver platter made of good intentions. Within 60 minutes, Dr. Mercer had constructed a paper fortress that would bury anyone, let alone a night shift nurse with no institutional allies. An immediate incident report to risk management, filed electronically with timestamps and a list of 8 witness signatures. A supplemental filing invoking policy violation 7.3.2 with cross-references to 3 additional policies regarding chain of command and unauthorized procedures. A formal documentation trail that spanned 14 separate forms, each one citing her pattern of insubordination, the break room conversation about inventory discrepancies, the way she'd questioned equipment orders, the moment she'd told him he was committing fraud in front of the entire shift. His CC list read like an organizational chart of everyone who mattered: the medical board, hospital legal, administration, risk management, the chief of surgery. His language was precise. Clinical. Devastating. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The HR office smelled like stale coffee and the particulate haze of people who'd been stressed into numbness about 7 minutes before Katie sat down across from Janet Whitmore, the hospital's termination specialist, who'd already prepared a manila envelope with Katie's ID badge and security credentials inside. "We've reviewed Dr. Mercer's documentation," Janet said, sliding a stack of printed forms across the desk. 14 separate incident reports. Clear pattern of insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. Violation of chain of command. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd done this 200 times and found no joy in any of it. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You can collect personal items from your locker but nothing patient-related. Katie read the termination paperwork without speaking. 7 pages. Her signature required on 4 of them. She read the policy violations, all accurate, all documented, all undefendable, without revealing things that would land her in federal prison for violating classification statutes that treated her like a ghost haunting the margins of official existence. Her hands didn't shake as she signed. Security came 20 minutes later, 2 officers she didn't recognize, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd escorted out dozens of disgraced employees. They walked her through the emergency department as the night shift watched in carefully orchestrated silence. Linda was at the medication cart, suddenly absorbed in inventory counts. Marcus pretended to study his phone with intense concentration. The other nurses found urgent tasks that required them to look away, to ignore the woman who'd saved one of their own and was being expelled for it like a contaminated specimen. Katie walked between the 2 security officers with her head level, her jaw tight, her uniform still bearing the sweat stains of the procedure that had cost her everything. No one made eye contact. No one spoke. The only sound was her shoes on the tile floor, that same rhythmic percussion that had marked her invisible existence at St. Michael's for the past 6 months. Now it was the sound of her erasure. She drove to an empty diner on the northern edge of Colorado Springs, the kind of place where the coffee came in chipped ceramic mugs and the night staff had learned not to ask questions about the people who showed up at 3 a.m. with the particular emptiness of those who'd lost something irreplaceable. The parking lot held only 3 vehicles, a trucker's rig, an older sedan, and her car. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made living things look slightly cadaverous. Katie chose a booth near the window, ordered coffee from a waitress who had kind eyes and practiced invisibility, and sat alone in the reflection of the glass as her life split in 2. In that reflection was a woman who'd saved 37 lives in combat. 37 individual human beings who'd walked away from Ramadi alive because this woman had held the line at an aid station for 11 hours straight while rounds came through the walls and the structure around her collapsed and 4 contractors died in the chaos and the Pentagon decided that everyone involved would be deleted from official record. 37 lives. Hands that had moved on pure muscle memory and training and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing the world could throw at her. Those same hands had just saved a 38th life, had performed a field thoracotomy in a civilian hospital with a combat knife and without asking permission from people who wouldn't have understood the difference between being right and being procedure compliant. In that same reflection was a woman who couldn't explain any of it. Who couldn't defend herself without triggering the federal alarms she'd spent 3 years avoiding. Who couldn't say Captain Katie Morrison because that name only existed in classified files marked with encryption that meant life imprisonment if she tried to claim it. She couldn't tell them about Ramadi or the Rangers or the reason she knew exactly where the second intercostal space was or why her hands knew how to save a life with nothing but a blade and desperation. She couldn't tell them that Staff Sergeant Chen was the reason she'd left the army in the first place, that seeing his unconscious face had cracked open 3 years of sealed compartments, that she'd had no choice because he was her responsibility and that responsibility didn't end because the Pentagon said it did. The coffee sat in front of her, steam rising and then dissipating, the surface slowly cooling from scalding to merely hot to eventually lukewarm. The diner's fluorescent fixtures buzzed and flickered like insects caught in the spaces between functioning and failing. A trucker paid his bill and left, his boots heavy on the tile floor, his trucker cap pulled low. The waitress refilled a coffee pot behind the counter. Outside, the Colorado Springs night was vast and indifferent and full of the kind of silence that only happened when you were completely alone in a place designed for being together. The titanium Ranger ring felt like an anchor on her finger, pulling her toward a past she couldn't claim and a future that didn't exist yet. Katie sat in that booth until 4:32 a.m., watching her reflection in the window, understanding that the woman looking back at her was about to discover that some secrets don't stay buried, not when they wear dog tags, not when they leave evidence written in ink on 14 hospital forms, not when the Pentagon has been looking for Captain Katie Morrison in every database and surveillance system on the continent and just received an automated flag that lit up like a Christmas tree because St. Michael's Hospital had finally, after 3 years of silence, run a background check on a night shift nurse. 2 days after Katie slipped out of St. Michael's with a security escort and a termination letter, Staff Sergeant Chen's eyes opened. The fluorescent ceiling lights came into focus first, then the morphine drip attached to his left arm, then the monitor tracking his heart, steady, strong, alive. A nurse he didn't recognize checked his pupils, noted something in his chart, and left him in the soft hum of machines that had kept him breathing while everything above his ribs healed. In a hospital administrator's office on the 3rd floor, a routine background check was running, the standard pre-discharge procedure required by insurance before any patient could be released. The system cross-referenced the unconscious John Doe's fingerprints against federal databases. And then it found something. A classified Pentagon-level security clearance came back encrypted, flagged for immediate escalation. Alerts shot up chains of command that Katie Morrison, the discharged night shift nurse, never wanted to see again. Katie didn't know any of this. She was home, sitting in an apartment she'd rented under her civilian social security number, staring at a phone that hadn't rung. But something pulled at her that afternoon, muscle memory, or survival instinct, or whatever you call the weight that keeps you tethered to someone you saved. She changed into civilian clothes, borrowed a baseball cap, and waited until the shift change at 6:41 p.m. when the nursing station got busy with the transition handoff. She slipped through the ER like she'd never left, her footsteps soundless on the tile floor, her body remembering every corner of this place. The stairwell door opened without a sound. She climbed 2 flights and found his room. Chen was awake, staring out at the Colorado sky turning pink with sunset. His eyes moved when the door closed. They locked on Katie's face, and for a moment neither of them breathed. His hand moved, the 4-line tugging at his wrist, and his lips formed 2 syllables. Reaper 6. Her call sign. The one only her team in Ramadi had known. Only him, and Rodriguez, and the 3 other Rangers who died in the explosion that the Pentagon buried so deep it stopped showing up in declassified records. Katie stepped closer. She didn't speak. She just let him see her, not as a nurse in scrubs, but as the captain who'd held the line at the aid station for 11 hours while shrapnel sang past like wasps and Rodriguez bled out into her hands and the whole operation went sideways in ways that still couldn't be discussed in anything classified lower than top secret compartmented. I never thought. Chen's voice was rough, cracked from intubation. Nobody knew you got out. I didn't get out, Katie said quietly. I got buried. A knock came at the door before either of them could speak again. A Marine officer in dress blues entered, captain rank, a Marine liaison with a folder in his hands and a face Katie recognized from the Ramadi base, though she'd never spoken to him directly. His eyes went wide when he saw her. He straightened his spine. Captain Morrison, he said, and it wasn't a question. Sir. The Marine opened his folder. Inside was Chen's after-action report, the official document that would have to account for how he survived a highway crash that killed everyone else in the vehicle. Staff Sergeant Chen, the Marine began, your report indicates that emergency intervention by medical personnel. He paused. His eyes moved to Katie. Back to Chen. Your report states that the captain who held the line at the Ramadi aid station for 11 hours performed the emergency procedure that saved your life. That would be a Captain Katie Morrison, Chen said. Reaper 6. Delta Team, Operation Nightfall. The silence in the room became something physical. The Marine's jaw worked, but no words came out. He reached for his phone. By 8:14 p.m., the entire hospital knew something was happening. By 8:40 p.m., a 2-star general from Fort Carson walked through St. Michael's front doors in pressed dress uniform, his presence clearing rooms like a ship's wake. He moved through the corridors with absolute certainty, and when he found Katie in the hallway outside Chen's room, he came to a stop. For 5 seconds, he said nothing. Then he saluted. Not a casual salute. A formal, deliberate salute to an officer of equal or superior standing. Captain Morrison. Your record has been unsealed as of 1,600 hours today, effective immediately. The Pentagon extends its apologies for your service and its regret for the operational security requirements that necessitated your separation from active duty. Katie's voice came out steady. My decorations, sir, are being retrieved from secure storage as we speak. Bronze stars, Purple Heart, your Ranger tab. You're being processed for a medical discharge with full honors and retroactive pay restoration. The general stepped aside, and that's when Katie saw them, the shadow box being carried by two junior officers, her decorations catching the hospital lights like they were waiting for her to be brave enough to claim them again. While the general was still speaking, Dr. Mercer made his move. He was in the IT closet 14 minutes later, hands shaking, accessing the security system with the override credentials he'd obtained months ago as part of the hospital's disaster recovery protocol. He found the footage from the night of Chen's procedure, video that showed his explicit orders telling Katie to wait, video that showed her ignoring him, video that proved he'd tried to prevent her from saving a life. He deleted the files, cleared the backup, scrubbed the server logs with methodical precision, his breathing controlled, his hands steady because this was how you survived. This was how you made evidence disappear. But Mercer had made one calculation error. The hospital's IT administrator, Marcus Chen, had been noticing those wrong equipment receipts for 6 months. Marcus, who was a Marine Corps veteran himself and understood the particular way military people moved through the world. Marcus had started saving every frame of security footage to an external drive the moment he realized Dr. Mercer was committing fraud. That drive sat in Marcus's kitchen drawer, untouched, until he walked into the FBI field office in downtown Colorado Springs the next morning with timestamps and file logs that proved Mercer had deleted evidence of a felony. Federal auditors arrived at St. Michael's within 48 hours. They found the Synthex equipment requisitions, 50 units ordered, 30 delivered, the difference split between Mercer's Consulting LLC and the supplier's offshore account. They found the deleted footage that Marcus's backup had preserved. They found 8 other hospitals where Mercer had run the same scheme. His attorney advised full cooperation. The medical board revoked his license. The criminal investigation began its machinery. 6 months later, the shadows in Katie's office fell at a different angle. The name on her door read Captain Katie Morrison, Director of Veterans Trauma Services. The position didn't exist until she did, because St. Michael's finally had someone who could walk into the ER, recognize a 78-year-old Vietnam vet in flashback, and know exactly which part of his nervous system had locked down, and why, and what voice to use to talk him down. Staff Sergeant Chen was in the long-term care wing, his chest healed enough that he could walk now, slow and careful, like a man learning how to exist in a body that had been broken and put back together by someone who knew exactly where all the pieces belonged. Katie brought him something today, something she'd carried in a zippered pocket for 3 years. The flag. The folded flag from Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez, their medic, the man who died holding the line beside her while the whole operation went sideways and the Pentagon decided the easiest solution was to make all of them disappear. His family's been waiting for answers, Katie said quietly, placing the folded triangle into Chen's hands. The Pentagon's unsealing everything next month. Operation Nightfall goes public. Rodriguez gets his name on the memorial. His family gets to know what happened to their son. Chen's hands shook, not weakness, but gravity, the weight of 3 years finally touching the earth. Reaper 6, he whispered. I need some jello, Katie said, and Chen laughed, which meant his chest hurt, which meant the healing was real. Linda found Katie in her office that afternoon, coffee in one hand and shame in the other. The break room nurse, the one who'd abandoned Katie when Mercer made it clear that friendship came with consequences. I should have asked you questions, Linda said. Instead of just believing what everyone was saying. Katie looked at her across the desk. You didn't know what you were looking at. But you did. You knew the whole time. And you stayed quiet. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is holding it all together. Katie touched the titanium ring on her desk, the one she'd given Chen 3 years ago, back when she was still a captain with a team and a future. It sat next to her own, both of them catching the light from the window overlooking the mountains where she'd finally stopped running. The decorations hung in a shadow box on her wall now. Bronze star. Bronze star. Purple heart. Purple heart. And at the very bottom, the Navy Cross, the award so rare that seeing it meant someone had done something that changed the shape of everyone around them. The parking lot below was visible through that same window. Dr. Mercer was loading equipment into a van, the same van he drove now, the one marked with the logo of the medical supply company that had paid him kickbacks. He drove it for wages now, not commissions, because the federal sentencing guidelines had been clear: 3 years probation, restitution, community service. A parole officer sat in the passenger seat, reviewing his routes, checking his hours. Mercer had tried to argue that the equipment fraud was industry standard, that everyone did it, that the system was designed that way. Nobody listened. The court transcript was public record. When Chen appeared in her doorway on crutches, grinning like a man who'd been given his life back twice, Katie stood. "Reaper 6, he said. "They're asking for you in the ER." Veteran came in, Army medic, retired, and he's asking for the captain who actually knows what she's doing. Katie pulled on her white coat, the one with her name embroidered under the Ranger scroll. The scars on her forearms caught the light, old scars, mission scars, the kind that told stories nobody needed to ask about anymore. She walked toward the elevator, toward the ER, toward the job she was always meant to do. This time, she walked in the open. Under her real name. As herself. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't see your real value, subscribe and let us know in the comments. Hit like if you believe heroes walk among us wearing scrubs instead of uniforms.